Hi, welcome back to another episode of Nobody's Doing It Right, the podcast for those who are uncertain. My name is Kat. I am your host. Today's episode is about how you ultimately decide. Now, I want to preface this by saying that there are many things in life you cannot control. Illness, disease, political unrest, all that stuff is out of your control, right? A lot of life is you just being pulled down a stream and you just have to be along for the ride and do whatever you can to handle it and to be okay, right? However, there are also many things in life that you can control that you might not think you're able to control, but ultimately they are just about deciding to do or not do that thing, depending on what it is you're struggling with, right? Something that I've had to deal with a lot and I've struggled with is my powerlessness or feeling powerless in many ways, right? Thinking that I cannot change this or I can't do this because I just can't. I don't have the power to. It's just not in my power. I can't. Whether that means asserting boundaries or whether that means, doing something that takes you one step closer to the kind of person you want to be, to live the kind of life you want to live. All that stuff is in your hands. Again, aside from the things that are not in your hands, right? And we know what those things are. Those things that are completely and totally uncontrollable. However, I will say, as I say that, sometimes it can get skewed in our minds what that feels like, right? So I don't want to say it's 100% this. I will never say that in any of my content, that this is 100% what it is, right? Everybody's different. Everybody's perception of things is different. There are many times, even in my own life, where, because I have a lot of medical anxiety, sometimes I feel like I can prevent, illness from happening. A lot of time you can't, right? But sometimes you can. So, understanding what the differences between the two and what that line is, it can be tricky, but I think with more self-awareness and more recognition of where your true power actually lies, you can get better at it. At least I have, right? So I hope this helps anybody else, of course. But again, this isn't to say this is 100% how you do it or what life is like. Like, I can't speak for everybody. I'm just speaking for what I've learned from my own experience, right? But a lot of things in my life that I thought I could never do were simply because I didn't decide to do them. Because, there's that feeling of powerlessness there. Like, I can't do it. It's just not what I'm capable of. It's not who I am or whatever. But ultimately, for me, it came down to just deciding to do it. And that, I think, also applies to many other people too. There are some things in your life that you can just decide to do. And it really just comes down to your decision, to just thinking, I'm going to do this, and then just doing it. And the crazy thing about this is that when you do that, when you finally decide and you do it, you realize how wrong you were about everything. And that actually is a bit jarring to realize, right? Like, whatever it might be. Like, for a long time, I remember when I first started therapy back in 2018, so years ago, I remember saying to my therapist that I couldn't be open and honest with people in my life. Like, I just couldn't tell them the truth about something, right? I couldn't. And then when I did, months later, about a specific situation, when I did say the truth, made that decision and just did it, I was like, oh wait, no, I could always have said it. I could always have spoken my truth to this person and nothing would have, like, it wasn't as scary or impossible as I thought it was, right? Being a people pleaser at the time, a very big one. I still struggle with it, but I'm better now. But being a really big people pleaser at the time, in my head, I had just gone into that identity of like, I can't do this. I can't, because it would go completely against my people pleasing, right? But when I just decided to do it, I stepped out of that identity for like a brief second and just decided like, I'm just going to take the action. Just take the action. It's not aligned with any belief or expectation. Just do the thing. The moment I did it, I completely changed the entire identity of who I was, because before that moment, I thought I was someone that I couldn't do it. I couldn't. And then I did it. So now I could. So now I was a different person, basically. And it's so, like, that specific scenario, I remember, shifted my entire perception of what it means to just decide on things and who you are and how you do things, right? Now, mind you, this is a lesson that I've had to learn over and over again, because I think a lot of the stuff I talk about, a lot of these things, these awarenesses, they manifest in different ways throughout your life. So you might understand it in one regard, like in one aspect of your life, but it might manifest later on in life in a different way. And you don't realize the connection to the last way that it manifested. So you think this is a whole new situation you have to tackle. But it's exactly the same thing as it was in the other way, in the previous way. It just looks different. So you don't realize that it's the same thing until you do the thing, right? You take the same action that you did before and you're like, oh yeah, no, this is exactly the same concept, just in a different way. So I've learned this before in my life, but it was that moment when I realized it had to do with interpersonal relationships, right? Before that, I think I've mentioned this before, but back when I was in my early 20s, I went through a fairly, like, I guess, substantial weight loss. It was something that I always struggled with in my life. My family's always struggled with it. So my identity was that this is what my body looked like. Like, I could not necessarily change it. Now, for some people, like, your body is your body, right? Like, there are many things in your body that you can't change. There are many things about my body now that I can't change, and it's fine. Like, I've accepted that, right? But I remember looking back in retrospect now at my younger self who had internalized this identity that I saw from the people around me, from the ideas, from our culture, just from the lack of knowledge or information of, like, good health practices, right? Just general good practices for yourself. I'd internalized the identity of, like, this is just not who we are or what we do or how life is for us or what our bodies look like or feel like even. That I then did things to validate that belief, to reinforce that belief that were not good for me, and continue to create the same cycle over and over again. So I kept validating that belief and identity of who I am, what I look like, and this is all I can do, whatever. So I kind of overcame that, and I was really proud of myself because not necessarily about the weight loss itself and, like, it's about being skinny all the time, right? Because obviously that leads to a lot of body dysmorphia and all that stuff, but more about the idea of, like, oh no, that identity that I had before was not true, because clearly I changed it, right? And I've changed, my body has changed throughout the years too, because it changes as you get older, right? Like, so my identity has shifted simply because of actions I've taken, and realizing that sometimes just deciding to do something, deciding to take an action completely changes your reality. It changes your identity, changes the belief you have about who you are and what you're worthy of or what you're capable of. So there are many things in life that is just about you deciding. So that was a more physical example, right? And I learned that lesson when I was younger, and I was like, oh yeah, see, I can change my physical self in many ways just by deciding to do something different, right? Deciding to eat differently or deciding to move my body more, right? Just deciding and doing, right? This can apply to even, like, other physical things too, like cutting your hair. All of a sudden now you're no longer a person who can't ever cut their hair. You know, some people have, like, a fear of that. I think I used to be like that when I was younger. This idea of, like, no, you have to have long hair. But then you cut it and all of a sudden now you are a person that can cut their hair. Do you know what I mean? Like, something like that. Those are more, like, physical examples. But it was in the therapy session when I had that realization that this also applies to emotional things as well. You know, interpersonal relationships as well. The deciding aspect and factor of life. I can just decide to show up differently in my interpersonal relationships, and I'm no longer tethered to the identity of who I thought I was before, because I did the opposite of what I said I couldn't do. So that means I can do it now. So that means I'm a different person. So then it also makes you question your entire existence as a human. Like, who are you really if you can just decide to change? And the beauty of that is that you can be anything and everything and nothing in many ways, right? Like, your identity can often just be an expression of what you decide, right? And that's both, like, scary and very liberating to realize that you can just decide tomorrow to not be who you are right now, for the better or for the worse, right? Like, whatever you decide. And I'm not trying to advocate for being not good to people or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, if you wanted to do that, you could do that. Like, that you just decide to do it, right? And hopefully, you know, you take that realization towards being better to people, right? We don't want to encourage any negative action, but sometimes what we think is negative, like stating a boundary, is not actually a negative action. It's not actually a bad thing to somebody, even though internally we feel that way, right? We feel like, if I say this to this person, they're going to be so hurt. They're going to hate me. They're going to be so upset. And it's like, is that true? Is that true? Like, decide to take the action and see. You don't know. You really don't know, right? So again, there's so much nuance to this conversation. There are so many ways to look at it and understand it for yourself, and align with what feels most authentic to you as a person, and being, you know, your most aligned self. And I don't want to say your best self, because what does best even mean? I don't want to imply any level of, like, perfection, but your kindest self, your most loving self, right? You can just decide to show up like that. And sometimes what it means to be your most loving and kind self means stepping up for you and going against somebody else, right? again, a lot of nuance to this. It's not easy. I'm not saying like it's just, once you decide everything's perfect. Like, no. Life is still going to have ups and downs. Life is still going to be uncomfortable. But a lot of the stuff that we think we can't do or think we can only do, this is the only way for us to show up, is truly hinging on whether or not we decide to do differently. You can just decide. I know there's so much that underlies that, right? There's so many things holding you back. There's so many things making you feel scared to just decide to do it. I understand that. For me, it helped a lot to really step back and look at it objectively and strip away those identities and expectations. It's not easy, of course, but practice it. Journaling, of course, something I always recommend. It's always helped me throughout my life. What if I did this thing? Let's just do a thought experiment, right? In your journal. What if I did this? What if I just decided to do this and I did it? What do I expect to happen? Or what could I see happening? Or how would I feel about it? Or what am I scared of people thinking or saying? Like, play it out in your journal. Let yourself see it all. I think it helps to kind of almost play act in your mind sometimes, right? Not always, because that can kind of lead to rumination, which I talked about in another podcast episode, and that can get really intense and really dark. But I think sometimes it can help to kind of to play act it, just to get a feeling, to get a little vibe check of what you could feel like potentially, right? And you might feel really good and you don't realize it yet because you have this thought in your head of like, no, I can never do that. It's like, but what if I did? What would that feel like? And all of a sudden it feels really good. And now it's so much easier to make the decision to do the thing, So it is ultimately, in many cases, not all, of course, not all, but in many cases with things in your life that are so specific and intricate to you, it's just about deciding. Just decide it, right? Decide to eat a different breakfast. Decide to eat and practice it in small ways. Like eating a different breakfast is you practicing it in a small way so that you can kind of prime yourself to do it in bigger ways, potentially, right? That's helped me many, many times. Just practicing in small ways. Going to a coffee shop and trying something different. Now, I am a creature of habit. I love my routines. They help me feel grounded and, I use those to really make me feel a lot better, which is great. But sometimes if I want to practice just deciding and changing my mind and doing something different, I do it in small ways like that. Going to my coffee shop, getting something different. Sometimes that new thing that I get might not be as good as my normal thing, and that's fine. You deal with the consequences of that, right? But it's not about the outcome. It's about the act of deciding, right? The act of switching it up. The act of like, I'm just going to do something different today. I'm going to decide on it and I'm doing it, and it's done. And now I'm somebody who doesn't always have to get the same order at the coffee shop all the time. I'm someone who might spontaneously decide something else. So just to show yourself that you can be different, that you can be a kind of person who just decides to do something different, and your identity is not rooted in what you think you can and can't do, and that's it, and it's stagnant and there's no change and that's it, so there's no point trying. Like, no, you are a flexible human who is constantly in flux, and you can decide differently in any given moment. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it offered you a different perspective or helped you maybe decide on something that you're scared to decide on right now. If you want to talk about this in more detail with me, feel free to book a one-to-one call. Of course, I'm not a therapist. I say this all the time, but I think it's worth repeating as many times as I can. If you want to read about these topics, I write over on my Substack, so you can subscribe over there. And you can follow me on my social media accounts as well. I'll have all the links in the show notes below. If you can leave a rating and review for this podcast, that'd be great too. And I'll be back again soon with another episode.